I'm Maureen Ballatori, and this is Spilled Salt, a podcast on the thrills and spills from the food, beverage, and agriculture industries. We have a well-known to me guest on today's podcast. Jennifer Gyuricska is Agency 29's marketing strategist, and we thought it would be fun. We are so frequently asked about how we launch the podcast and how we go about sharing episodes, and I can't take credit for that. A lot of it came from Jen. And so in today's episode, we're interviewing each other really about our different roles and responsibilities as it relates to getting Spilled Salt episodes and seasons out the door on a regular basis. If you have any questions about following up from this in terms of a brand perspective about whether or not it makes sense for you to have a podcast for your brand, I'd be delighted to talk about that. You can reach me at Maureen@agency29.com. Enjoy the conversation. Hey, Jen, how are you?
Hey, Maureen. I'm glad to be on the podcast in front of the camera instead of behind it.
I know, I'm so excited to do this and just preparing all of our listeners. There will probably be more giggling than usual on this episode and laughter, but it should be a fun one, talking about how to launch a podcast. So with that, your background is a big reason why we're here and why we're doing this. So start us there.
Well, I have to say, I read your podcast transcripts and I know that there's a lot of giggling, which transcribes to heh 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 heh.
Yes, true.
My background, however. So back in the day, a lot of years ago, I had this idea to be in marketing. I should go into radio promotions. I don't know how those two things got synced up in my high school brain, but way back before Y2K, I graduated from a radio program at a technical institute and used all the skills I learned about communicating and news and interviewing and writing to launch me forward into a career in marketing and promotions. So since then, I've done a lot of years of experience in a lot of different industries, and I have finished a bachelor's in communication studies, and I have been working with you and Agency 29 in different iterations since about 2016.
Yeah, long time. You just said you don't know how marketing kind of translated to radio promotions in your mind. But if you think back, where do you think that really started? Because I can tell you, radio never occurred to me. And I also had an interest. So was there somebody that you used to enjoy listening to on the radio that you thought, man, that might be kind of fun? Or...
Oh my gosh. So little nerdy Jen, back in the golden years of the Edmonton Oilers NHL hockey team, used to listen to a guy named John Short do talk radio about the hockey games. And I remember calling in, it being a small thrill in my tiny life at the moment. But what I really love is that feeling when you connect somebody to something and that they love it as much as you do. And so that's what I did. That may have been where radio and marketing. Back then, I thought marketing was sales. Now I know they are not the same thing. But the ability to connect and communicate and get people to try or meet or do something new is really where my true love is.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Connecting someone to something. And I feel like that's very Canadian of you to say that. And just for... Because it's so loving, right? Like it's about fit finding. We talk about that a lot in general.
I thought you meant the hockey reference.
Oh, well, yeah, that's where the original idea came from. But
that's
you said
very
this
Canadian too.
Yes, you said connect someone to something, and the running joke for Americans is that Canadians are the nicest people out there. So, which is true. It's based on my experience, but so. I wanted to, from there, kind of talk about, like Jen said, we've worked together for a really long time. I wanted to talk about where the idea for Spilled Salt came from. And I came up with the name first, which is really backwards from what usually happens for me. But I was thinking, came up with the idea, and then I was thinking maybe it would be a series of dinners where we would bring people all together and then have a special guest come and spill the salt, like spilling the tea, about something that they had experienced. And some of that idea of the dinners came from, I had once explored this concept of an event series called Fuck Up Nights, Do you remember when I was exploring that?
Yes. Yes, it was such a big thing for a while where everybody just talked about how they messed up in their careers.
Yes, yeah. So it was some of the idea of the dinner series came from that. And I was like, oh, this could be kind of cool. Like bring people in and sort of talk about spilling the salt of something that they had gone through, and then was talking to you about it. And I think where we landed was that would be really limiting in terms of our reach, because it would have to be local. And we've at Agency 29 really been focused on expanding outside of our own backyard. As much as we love local community and everything like that, we really need to continue to look further afield. And so I think it was you who said, what about a podcast?
Well, not only that, but I remember at the time too, you were exploring your speaking options and how to get in front of audiences. And podcasting is such a great way to bring yourself to the audience instead of bringing the audience to you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I remember that being part of the inspiration behind the podcast as well.
Mm-hmm. So then I agreed to the idea of a podcast reluctantly.
If this was a book, there'd be a few chapters in between, and maybe we could try something else.
Yeah, but eventually agreed, and then dragged my feet for many weeks. You said, are we doing this podcast or not? And I remember that was the moment for me where I was like, I gotta move on this or not, And so then the rest is history. Here we are. Like it worked out. But so from your perspective, I'm like, okay, let's do this. And, it was do this or not. And I said, all right, we're going to do it. I think that we should do it. And I had agreed with you for all of the reasons that you gave for why we should do a podcast. So for listeners, I would love for you to elaborate on that. What are some of the reasons why someone might want to have their own podcast?
So we touched on one there in that it's a great way to bring yourself to the audience where they already are. It's a little tougher to get in front of crowds at conferences, and when you put on a workshop, there's a whole lot more homework that has to go on for a short-term benefit. But we're providing evergreen content, which is not only connecting you to people who we can help and that we are fascinated by, but also in getting our name out there on a regular basis, having content that is up to the minute, that's very on trend, that's industry specific, all the great things. And like I say, meeting these fantastic people.
Right. And so then with the strategic underpinnings clear, right, of all of the reasons why we should, what was then your approach to how to do the show? And I know we're going to talk about tech stack, and so that it'll probably leave us into that, but take listeners first through not just the tech stack, we can talk about that next, but more so in terms of your approach for like, how do we record the episodes? What do we then do with it, right? Some of that.
Well, when you said that usually you don't think of the name first, what it was is, a bunch of showers where we're ideating, drives in cars, back roads kind of thing, where we had thought about these things for a long time. And one of the major aspects that we wanted to touch on is what perspective do we have? What do we want to talk about? What can we talk about on a regular basis? And when you thought about spilled salt, that's when it all coalesced for us. We started thinking about, yes, the thrills, the spills, what goes on in the real lives of these entrepreneurs and these businesses. And so that is the other half. Most people might not have a name that's as fantastic as spilled salt right off the bat, but it's that purpose. What can you talk about consistently? What do you have a perspective on? And how does it tie back into your business goals? So we thought about all of that stuff that was initial before we even got started on choosing guests or choosing tech or any of those things. And then because we are Agency 29, we needed to have a fantastic look to our brand. We wanted to make sure that we were hitting all the right notes. Then we reached out, we started talking about who would we have on the show, how long episodes would be. So we know that the average commute is between 20 and 25 minutes, although we have a little more to talk about than that. We didn't want to have a super long podcast either. So we touched on all these things. Advertising, did we want to have advertising? And how are we going to tell people, and how are we going to get listeners for the podcast? Basically, it's how do we tell people that we're existing? The lights are on in this podcast home. So those are a lot of the homework we started to do. And then how will we format it and how will we communicate it, which leads into our tech stack conversation. But I know you have a question. Let's see.
Yes, I do. You can see it on my face. Of course you can. So talk about how we share it, how we share the episodes, and why we do it in the way that we do with like the blog, and why we're doing video and audio recordings and some of that.
So in our content marketing strategy, we used to do a lot of different things. In the past, we've had the 29 by 29 series. We have blog posts, we have case studies. But when it came down to it, the podcast was the best mix of all of the things. And that's really what we use for a lot of our content marketing nowadays. So we pull in those sort of strategies into how we share the episode. One of the things is transcripts. We have full transcripts on our website because that's great for SEO. It's got all those terms in it. Plus, it's giving our guests another moment of amplification. Plus, it gives our social team a great spot to pull the fantastic quotes from. We have the sound bites that we pull from the podcast as well as the video. Many people have talked about creating once and distributing in 100 different ways. And you're nodding because you know that I love that we create one big cornerstone piece, like a podcast episode, in which we can pull half a dozen videos out of, half a dozen audio clips. Plus, we've got that content in the form of a blog post and all of those quotes that we can pull into different formats. Plus, when we share it to social media, we think about our channels. Not only are we a long form podcast on YouTube, but we pull YouTube shorts and share them to our channel. We have reels and videos and carousels and posts for Instagram. Same with Facebook. X, we're not as hot on these days, but there's so many potential opportunities on that channel, and Pinterest, and we could even get going on Reddit if we wanted to. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of different ways that we can share it. Plus, we ask our guests, here's the episode link, go ahead and tell your friends about it, because then we're amplifying to their audiences as well.
Yeah. And I want to just highlight a couple of things that you just mentioned for the listeners that go into some of the things that people might not be thinking about when they're thinking about launching a podcast. You mentioned that we have the episodes specifically around 20 to 30 minutes because that's roughly the average commute for, the average everyday listener. So it wasn't just arbitrary, like, I don't know, 30 minutes sounds good. It was intentional with that choice. And then also in terms of syndicating the content, not only with the fact that the video and audio then gets repurposed and shared via a blog, which is meant to optimize SEO and drive social content to the website to then capture that user under our umbrella, all of those things. I think that is the reason why when I talk to people and they realize that we have the podcast, that they get really excited, because I think that people know what goes into doing it well, and the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And it clearly is on this. I've been really surprised at how excited other people are about the fact that we've got the podcast. So with that, in terms of anybody out there who is interested in doing this on their own, what are our preferred choices from a tech stack perspective?
Well, the bonus about tech and software nowadays is there's a lot of great options that are not super expensive out there. And so, for example, I'm testing Adobe's podcast beta right now. The Creative Suite's just launched a podcast. But right now we use Riverside. We're in Riverside right now recording our episodes. We use Premiere to...
So before you move on from what we're doing, explain why we chose Riverside.
We chose Riverside for the ways that we can share the video and the audio. So there's a lot of opportunities on the back end of this where we can have one person's video up at a time, both people, we can stack them vertically, we can make them horizontal. The software automatically pulls the transcripts, not perfectly, but pretty darn good. Thank you, AI. And that's a conversation in itself right there, isn't it? But yeah, it gives us a lot of different opportunities at a decent price point.
Yep. Great.
And
What else?
so again, we move Adobe Creative Suites. We use that across the agency for a lot of different options. And their Premiere program is pretty fantastic when it comes to editing the podcast, layering in the graphics and the sounds, and then pulling just the audio as well. And that so we share our audio to Podbean. Podbean is our podcast distributor that gets us on Apple and Google. Well, it's YouTube podcast now. And iTunes and all the other things.
Yep,
Apple and iTunes
Spotify.
are the same. Spotify. We have the whole list. All the podcast, it automatically distributes through our RSS feed, as well as providing a podcast website for us. So we have that. And then, of course, we have our WordPress website, which we host the episodes on. And we distribute across, what else do we use for our tech stack? That's pretty much it. I will admit, I do use ChatGPT to help me with some of the transcripts and the wordiness that AI does. So that, I guess, would be our final tech stack option.
Yep. Yeah. And you use AI to generate a summary of it takes the transcript from the episodes and episode and generates a summary. And it's funny, sometimes I'll be reading that before it goes live, just as a check, right? Did the transcript hear what that person was really talking about? So sometimes I am making true corrections there, but there will be times where the AI summary will say, this person started this business, inherited it from their father. And I'm like, and I'll note in the Google Doc that we're kicking back and forth in these edits, I don't recall them saying that. Well, it is not 99% of the time it's true, because it can't pull that information from anywhere else. So it's just that the human brain didn't remember it, but the computer, got that all in the transcript.
And a note of caution about the AI, we always have to go back. I tend to break all of my AI use into pieces because it wants to use repetitive, fancy sounding words that nobody uses in regular everyday speech. So I need to break that up. Sometimes it runs with an error and goes wild with it. So if there's a mess up in the transcript, then and also, especially with Riverside here with the transcript that it automatically generates, there's been times we've been back and forth saying, what did he say here? What was this word? Is this what it's supposed to be?
Yeah.
Oh, and YouTube's automatic captions never, ever spell Maureen Ballatori correctly. I don't know why that is either. So, I mean, AI is lovely and a bit of a time saver with things that I already know, and I'm just looking to smooth and efficiently smooth things out. But it is not the answer. You really need a personal, like a real person back here, a personal touch to make everything work as the way we want it to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, too, my philosophy across the board on when is AI most useful, and it's when you use it as a tool and not as the solution, right? So I'm glad that you mentioned that we use it as a tool, and then we are making sure that we're going through and fact checking, which is critically important. If we're going to put on a show, it is wildly important that it's accurate, right? And that we don't have a guest come on that said one thing and the transcript got it wrong and we ran with it. No, I read the transcript from the interview before it goes out. I read that summary and make sure that it's accurate. And I'm doing that after you have already done that as well to catch any, issues from your perspective too. So all that to say that it really does take a number of eyeballs on this in order for it to be released effectively.
The other half of this conversation is about the guests themselves, and you just talked about how important it is to be accurate with them. Why don't you tell us how you find your guests? Is there a tool you use? How do you get guests on your show, Maureen?
Yeah, so when we first started with the first season, it was people that I already had in my network that I thought had an interesting story that I could pull in. And I was really looking for, the goal of the podcast and the agency is to be positioned in food, beverage, and agriculture. And so it was important to me to have guests in season 1, and still now we're just heading into season 5, to make sure that we have a nice arrangement of folks from different aspects of the industry. So we've had leadership development coaches. We've had CPG founders. We've had folks in cannabis. We've had farmers. We've had people in economic development that can speak to grants for food. So I like that we pull in people from different backgrounds and different that are doing different things now in food bev ag space. So as we've been kicking, Jennifer and I have been kicking back and forth for the last couple of weeks, the guest list for season 5, which includes some folks that we have reached out to from our own research, where like Jen does a first pass and says, hey, I think these are some people that would be good to consider. Others that I just meet in passing that are like, I'd love to be on your podcast, or I make this suggestion, I'd love to have you on the show. And then others, we're now getting PR pitches too from PR firms that are pitching us guests for folks that they work with. So it's definitely changed over the 5 seasons, but I'm looking for people with an interesting background as well as story for what they're doing now, and a good variety in each season.
Which leads me to my next question, because as you mentioned, originally you knew the folks, you had that connection, now less so. How do you prepare and research for each of the episodes?
Yeah, so I refuse to give anybody a question list, because anytime I've done that, I have found that they try to prescript themselves too much, and I want a casual conversation. So I tell them this is going to be a conversation just between friends. I'm not going to throw you any left hooks, and it's meant to be calm and casual and nothing that you can't answer, on the fly. So, in my research, I am ideally looking them up on LinkedIn. There have been a couple of guests that haven't had LinkedIn profiles. LinkedIn is really helpful because sometimes I can find something in their background that I want to specifically talk about, that can guide the conversation. But otherwise, I'm looking for like a couple of nuggets from their background. And if they don't have a LinkedIn profile, then I also type their name into Google and see what comes up there in terms of articles that they were mentioned in. What does their website say about them? What can I learn about their company if I'm not already familiar with it, or a company that they used to be involved with? So I'm looking up from the background perspective there, some interesting nuggets about what they're doing now, whether that's recent news or, anything coming down the pike. If I feel like they might be heading into an interesting space, I might ask them about industry trends. We've had a couple of guests from wineries, and I always ask them about the no and low alcohol movement, because there's a lot of changes that are happening in that from an industry perspective that I want their thoughts on. And then I generally go into like a what's next, and ask them about what do they see next for the business, or, are they launching new products, or what do they think is next for the industry? So I generally follow that cadence of like the history, the now, and the forward.
So you mentioned throwing left hooks for people's, and it reminded me of back in the day. And as an encouragement,
you threw a left hook at someone?
No, well, but that's a different story. Encouragement and inspiration for those who are either tentative about starting their own podcast or nervous about becoming a guest on a podcast. Back in the day when I worked at a small town Canadian radio station, I used to do something called the Tradio, where folks called in and they sold their couches on the radio way before the internet. Now I'm really dating myself. But I also used to go on scene. So I'd go on the weekends and go to the rodeos or the store sales or whatever and do cut-ins from those places. And the first time I was ever recognized at the Wainwright Rodeo, this family came up and they said, "Oh my gosh, you're Jennifer. We listen to you every morning. You're always messing up and then you laugh at yourself and it's hilarious."
Which is one of those like, is that a compliment? I don't know if that's a compliment.
I was so excited somebody recognized me, but it's only because I suck. But that's exactly it. There's highs and lows, and it's a bit bittersweet sometimes, but it's always, like you say, the juice is always worth the squeeze.
Yeah. The other thing that I find really helpful to do in an interview in the moment is if I really try to listen for something that someone might have said that listeners might not know what it is. So whether that's an abbreviation or they're making reference to something, I know them personally and they're making a local reference. You know, we have listeners from, you know, far beyond our own backyard. And so I like to, you know, define, okay, you mentioned this place, which for anybody who's not aware is, you know, and give a little definition. And so that's helpful too. I feel like that just makes it a more approachable show to listen to.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I mean, I always say it's the specificity that's interesting. Generality is always boring.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. So with that, we've talked about the history and the now. And so you know what's coming. What's next? What do you think is next for the podcast industry?
Well, we're already in the future. We're already moving into a place where all podcasts need video. It can't just be audio anymore. You definitely need a vlog to go along with it. We talked about AI. That's being used more and more, but Meta and YouTube and other channels, they're asking you to disclose it now whenever something is completely like we are not an AI created podcast, but I do have to check off that we are not on those channels. And I think where we're going, and we do see it, is more production values, a better focus on the actual creation of the podcasts. We want to see value and a reason to tune in to every episode. So I think that is really, podcasts are going to narrow down. Right now, it's a great big field, but I think it's going to narrow down really based on quality and production.
Mm-hmm. So I'm intrigued to hear you say that too, because so much changed in video over the last 4 years, right? We were really trending into everything was very produced, very overproduced. Then COVID hits, right? We get to this TikTok, you know, type content, right? Where it's authenticity first and the production value really could kind of go to the side as long as authenticity was coming to the table. And so I'm intrigued to hear you say that you think that the podcast industry is going toward more production value in what people are looking for. And speaking of specificity, could you be more specific about that in terms of what do you think needs to happen with production value for a podcast to elevate?
Well, I would agree in that during COVID, we kind of got sick of looking at screens for a little bit, but I think it was just a blip in our radar is basically what it was. We have always been moving more towards face-to-face, and that's what video provides. And when I say that production values increase, I don't mean that authenticity decreases, because that used to be, I mean, max headroom. We're not going to max headroom level here. We are staying with real people doing real things, but recording in your backyard where your neighbors mowing the lawn, that's not flying anymore. Podcasts where people just winging it and not providing steady content with each episode. Podcasts that come and go. So not to stop anybody from trying it out, because it absolutely is worth doing and is worth having a podcast to share your perspectives. But you have to be doing your best, whereas you used to just be able to record anything.
Yeah. I think that in summary of that, one of the things that's very important is the audio quality, right? So anytime I see a guest that has AirPods in, we are both intentionally in wired headphones right now. Anytime I see a guest come on that I'm interviewing that has the AirPods, I am always cautioning them, are you sure that those are not going to disconnect and that they're fully charged? Because that would be a big buzzkill. And I have heard in student pitch competitions at the university level that's the biggest challenge that they face is a student comes on aiming to pitch and then they've got a problem with the AirPods won't connect or something like that. So from an audio quality, I think that's one thing that is in a podcaster's full control that is important to maintain. And then you also mentioned consistency. I think one of the things that's been great for us and for me in particular, recording all of these interviews, is that if I was doing it all the time, it would be way too much and not something that we could stay consistent with, which is why we launch in seasons. Right? So we're heading into recording season 5 right now. I will record those episodes over 4 or 5 weeks in August and September, and then we will release them in, I think we said October, November. And so consistency is important, and our guests know that they listen to us in seasons, and we release an episode a week when we're in season, and then we go away, and then we'll come back later for another season. But it's setting the stage for your promise of what are you committing to doing with the show so that guests can expect when they can hear you.
And shout out to the team. I want to say too, we couldn't be consistent in what we do if we didn't have Olivia and Donna and Franca and Kayla and Colleen and Teresa all behind us helping with social media and the design and everything else that we pulled together. Even me on you and you on me pushing each other. What is this happening? It takes more than one person. You need the support to be consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I'll say too is you mentioned that the podcast is a great platform to share your perspective. Jen has been in my ear pushing me to share my perspective for years and years. And I have always been like, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't want to, I don't want to upset anybody.
Honorary Canadian.
Yeah, right. But I think that, and not to say that sharing your perspective has to be negative, but I think that one of the things that the podcast has done for me is invite me to be more vocal about sharing my perspective. So it's probably not a coincidence that we launched the podcast, and shortly thereafter, I started posting nearly daily on LinkedIn with what I lovingly call my rants, about just various aspects of the industry or the agency or food bev ag in general, just kind of observations and things that come to mind. I feel more willing and interested in doing that after having the podcast as a platform because it has made me a lot more comfortable in doing that.
And it's not to say that you have to be, the contrarian stance always works, but you yourself has such a unique way of looking at it. Everybody has their own unique way. All the thrills and spills on the episode would not be a thrill, would not be a spill for somebody else, but your unique perspective, the world needs it.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you for this. I'm sure that our listeners, it'll be interesting to see what everybody thinks about this episode too. Is a little bit of an outlier from our usually regularly scheduled programming. So as always, let us know what your thoughts are on content like this, if it's helpful for us to share a bit of a how-to. And thanks, Jen, for sharing all the behind the scenes.
Thanks for having me in front of the microphone.
Talk soon. Thank you for listening to Spilled Salt. I'm your host, Maureen Ballatori. Spilled Salt is an Agency 29 production. Agency 29 is a brand building firm for food, beverage, and agriculture brands. Learn more at agency29.com. For more information about the podcast, visit spilledsaltpodcast.com. Use that website to send me questions or recommendations for future guests. I always love hearing from you. Spilled Salt is available anywhere you enjoy your podcasts. Please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.